It was one of those days when everything felt off. I woke up, dragged myself out of bed, and caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror. My face looked older than it should. Too many late nights, too many cigarettes. My wife, Rachel, was still sleeping when I left for the station. I didn't wake her, didn't want to hear the complaints. I'd been hearing them more lately, ever since things started going downhill with the job. I knew what she was going to say anyway. Hey, why don't you just quit and do something else? And I would always have the same answer. I can't. We need the money. I hated myself for it. But it's true. I was drowning in debt. The kind of debt that makes you feel like you can't even breathe. Some days I'd think about throwing it all in and becoming a garbage collector. Just something simple, something without the weight of a fire on your shoulders every time the alarm goes off. But then I'd remember Rachel. If I left this job, she might leave me too. I'd be stuck with nothing but a pile of bills and a landlord who would throw me out in the middle of winter. So I kept on. The firehouse was my prison. The calls, the heat, the smoke, it was all becoming suffocating. I dragged myself into the kitchen, grabbed a cup of coffee, and lit a cigar. The bitterness of both seemed to settle my nerves for a bit, but it was a fleeting calm. I was a man stuck between decisions, stuck in a life I didn't want anymore, but couldn't seem to escape. I sat down at the table, looked at the deck of cards that had been gathering dust in the corner. The guys at the station still played sometimes, but most days they couldn't be bothered. Mike was always too tired or hungover, Tommy too eager to prove himself, and Ron was obsessed with the engine, always tinkering with it, always keeping busy so he didn't have to think about what he was doing with his life. As I sat there, the radio crackled to life with a call. Engine 3, Truck 5, structure fire, isolated cabin, possible victims, unknown cause, proceed with caution. I sighed, tossed the cigar in the ashtray, and stood up. Another day, another fire. But this time, something felt different. My gut twisted in a way I didn't want to admit, but I ignored it. We suited up, climbed into the truck, and hit the road. The drive out of town was quiet, the tires of the engine humming against the asphalt. It was cold outside, too cold for this time of year, and the trees lining the road looked bare, stripped of their leaves like bones in the winter wind. I didn't talk much on the way there. Tommy was flipping through cards again. Mike had his head against the window, staring blankly at the passing scenery. Ron, as usual, was preoccupied with the truck, as if we were about to face an engine failure in the middle of a fire. We made our way toward the cabin. The closer we got, the more I hated it. The smell of damp wood and decay hit my nose, but there was something else under it, something foul, like the stench of something long dead. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I tried to ignore it. The crew didn't seem to notice. They were used to this kind of thing, used to seeing burnt-out shells of buildings, but not like this. It was as if the world around us had been holding its breath. When we reached the door, I could feel something pressing against me. Something cold, like an invisible hand on my chest, pushing me away, but I shoved it down. "Let's go," I muttered to the guys, and we forced the door open. The inside of the cabin was worse. The air was thick, oppressive, like it was waiting for something. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper and the floor creaked under our boots, but it was what we saw in the far corner that made me freeze. There was something there. It wasn't a person. It wasn't even a shadow. It was like a mass of darkness, something that didn't belong. A shape, hunched and twisted, its limbs crooked at unnatural angles. Its head, if you could even call it a head, was just a black void. No eyes, no face, just darkness. My heart pounded in my chest. I froze, staring at it. I could hear the guys behind me moving, but I couldn't make myself turn around. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. It was like my throat had been locked shut by that thing. "Cap, you seen this?" Mike's voice was shaky, but I could barely hear him over the blood rushing in my ears. I nodded. Get out now." I didn't wait to see if they were following. I ran. I heard Mike and Tommy behind me, but I didn't stop until we were back outside. The cold hit me like a slap, and I gasped for air, but it didn't feel like relief. It felt like escape. We jumped into the truck, slamming the doors shut. As we drove away, the cabin behind us was nothing but a dark silhouette against the trees. But I knew that thing, that whatever it was, hadn't stayed behind. It had followed us out. I stared out the window, trying to calm my racing heart, but something inside me knew I hadn't seen the last of that cabin. or that thing, and I didn't know how I felt about that. Part of me was relieved, but the other part, the one that didn't want to face the truth, the one that had been running from it for so long, it was terrified. I just wanted to get home, get away from it all. But when I got back to the station, the familiar smell of smoke and sweat felt suffocating. I wanted to leave. I wanted to throw everything away, pack up and take that garbage collector job. But I knew I couldn't, not yet. Rachel would leave me. The landlord would throw me out, and all I'd have left was the emptiness of knowing that the fire, the cabin, and that thing would always be waiting for me, waiting to drag me back in, and maybe it already had. It was one of those cold nights in 1975 when everything seemed to drag on. The kind of cold that makes your bones ache, the kind where even your breath feels like ice. My shift was nearly over, and I was just about to pack up when the call came in. A fire in the old asylum just outside of town. I could hear the dispatcher on the other end of the line, but it didn't feel real at first. The asylum had been empty for years, everyone knew that. It had been closed down long before I even joined the force. The windows had all been boarded up, the place overrun with weeds and the occasional daredevil who thought they could spend the night inside for a thrill. But a fire? That was new. I glanced over at the clock. I'd been on shift for 12 hours already, and I'd barely gotten any sleep since last week. My feet ached, especially the one I nearly lost to a bad accident last summer. It still gave me trouble sometimes, especially in this weather. The bones don't quite heal the same way, and the cold gets right to it, making every step feel like I'm walking on broken glass. I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night with it throbbing, and my mind flashes back to that day. The sharp crack of bone, the blood, the shock. I snapped out of it when Daniels barked an order to load up. The truck roared to life, the cold air biting at my face as we sped out of the station. The whole town was asleep, but my mind was wide awake, locked in on what was ahead. The roads to the asylum weren't exactly well maintained. Dirt paths, thick trees on either side, the kind of place you didn't want to be after dark. The windshield wipers scraped across the glass, fighting against the sleet that was falling heavier now. The headlights cut through the dark, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out of place. When we got to the asylum, I knew something was wrong. The flames were high, crawling up the sides of the building, but they were different somehow. They weren't burning the way they should have been. No crackling or loud pops, just this low, eerie hum in the air. I could feel it before I even stepped out of the truck. The air felt thick, too still, like everything had been holding its breath. "Stay sharp," Daniels said, his voice colder than usual. It was strange. I'd worked with Daniels for years, and I knew his every move, his tone, but tonight something felt off about him. Maybe it was the way he looked at the building, or maybe it was because the rest of us were all too damn tired to feel like we could handle anything more. But I had no choice. I followed orders. We suited up and made our way toward the building. The wind picked up, biting at my exposed skin, but it didn't bother me like it usually did. It was the eerie quiet that got to me. No sounds of animals, no wind rustling the trees, just the fire and the whispers. At first, I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But the more I listened, the more certain I was that there was something else in the air. "Did you hear that?" Eddie asked from behind me, his voice barely audible over the wind. I turned to look at him. He was young, green, always a bit jumpy. "Shut up," I muttered. "Focus on the fire." But deep down, I was feeling it too, that something was wrong. The building was a wreck. The brick walls were cracked, the windows shattered, and the smell of smoke was already thick in the air. But there was something about the place that felt like it was alive. Wrong in a way that made my stomach churn. The flames were burning slowly in the lower floors, but they weren't behaving like they should have been. By the time we reached the entrance, I could feel the heat from the fire, but the temperature around us was strange. It wasn't right. It wasn't the usual warmth you get from a blaze. Instead, it felt like we were walking into something colder than the air outside. The cold didn't make sense, not with the fire right in front of us. "Let's move," Daniel said, but I noticed he was avoiding looking around too much. He was scanning, searching, like he expected something to jump out at him. The first floor of the asylum was mostly intact, but the smoke was thick and everything had this ashen quality to it, like the building was on the edge of collapsing at any moment. We moved cautiously, each step echoing through the dark hallways. The rooms we passed were empty, save for the scattered debris of a building long forgotten by anyone who cared. But then there were those whispers again, not from the fire, not from the wind, from somewhere deeper in the building. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something was watching us. I wasn't sure if it was the building itself or something worse. But I knew it wasn't normal. Eddie stopped dead in his tracks. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, a tremor in his voice. I didn't answer him. I was already moving forward. But before I could get too far, I heard it too. There, just beyond the hall, through an old door that stood ajar. A voice, low and gravelly, barely audible over the crackle of the fire, a hum. Against my better judgment, I stepped forward. I could feel the cold pressing in harder now, like it was trying to pull me in. I didn't look back, but I knew the rest of the crew was with me. We reached the door and pushed it open. Inside was a room I didn't recognize. It shouldn't have been here. The fire had touched every other part of the building, but not this room. The walls were bare, untouched by smoke or flame. The air was thick, stagnant. The only thing that stood in the center of the room was a figure. At first I thought it was a person, but no, it was too tall, too still. It stood there in a hospital gown, one of those old faded things that looked like it came from a century ago. The gown barely moved, as if it didn't even belong in this world. And its face, there was no face, just this blank empty space, no eyes, no mouth. I took a step back, my foot catching on the floorboards. I need to get out of here, I thought, but I couldn't move. The figure didn't budge. It didn't speak. It just stood there, an impossibility, in the middle of a burning building. Tommy, who had been behind me, made a sound, a mix between a gasp and a scream, and that was all it took. I turned, grabbed him by the arm, and yanked him out of the room. We ran, not looking back, and I could hear the others following, but that feeling stayed with me. The feeling that something was watching, waiting for us to leave. When we finally made it outside, the fire was still raging, but the room we'd been in was untouched. The figure? Gone. I don't know what I saw that night, but I know this much. I didn't belong there. None of us did. The nightmares started the night after the fire. It's been years since then, and I still get them sometimes. I can't shake the feeling that the building and whatever that thing was are still waiting, watching. Maybe that's why I sometimes think about walking away from this job altogether. Sometimes I think about finding something simpler, something that doesn't make my skin crawl or keep me awake at night. Something where I don't have to face the fire every time the pager goes off or risk my life in places I shouldn't even be. The thought of getting out of this line of work, it feels like freedom, but at the same time, it feels impossible.